think that on sort of the plus side, the emergence of surveys in higher education, we now have huge amounts of data over the last 10 years, especially from the NSS, over what students think, what students' opinions are, and a really broad range of sort of student feedback. And some people have sort of seen this as very democratic, as a way of making institutions far more responsive to students' needs and student preferences. The surveys are a big driver of enhancement, and most enhancement in education is sort of you need to increasingly use survey-based evidence in order to justify a new activity, a new way of teaching, a new way of restructuring the course. Many people would argue that surveys are useful because students are the recipients of education, and that they know effectively when education is working for them and when it's not, and when it's not, we need to find out. In particular, this is very useful with sort of surveys to identify issues for different diversities and demographics of students. So CSS enables us to understand far greater detail issues for disabled students, for Black and minority ethnic students, for a wide variety of students, and not just understand sort of like the needs of sort of the more traditional majorities. But on the other hand, some people would argue that surveys are not very helpful at all. Sometimes criticised for being consumerist and passive. That surveying students is not really engagement. There's sometimes the argument used that surveys are used to pressurise and manage teaching staff, and to give sort of performance indicators that value student satisfaction over student learning. There's the argument sometimes made that students aren't the best assessors of whether education is working for them, that sometimes that learning isn't necessarily a very sort of like is an easy process, it's a challenging process, and sometimes learning requires you not to be satisfied, it requires you to be challenged. And surveys require us to sort of break down education into quantifiable data, and some would argue that that isn't possible, that the real benefits of education are far too quantifiable, that they're somehow sort of intangible, and you can't just break them into tick boxes. Those arguments for and against run across all three of the surveys that I go through, but in particular, the most controversial and most prominent of all student surveys is the National Student Survey here in the UK. The NSS is owned to all final year undergraduates in higher education institutions in the UK. It's effectively compulsory in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and opt-in in Scotland, but all major higher education providers in Scotland do so, as do increasingly further education colleges that provide higher education. It's been running since 2005, was initially introduced to inform students. So the original purpose of the NSS was to in theory enable students to act as more informed consumers making university choices. Increasingly, it's moved towards as a rich data set for institutions to enhance their own practice and performance. I'm not sure if this figure is quite correct, about 400,000 participants, but it is one of the largest surveys in the UK. It's an absolutely massive data set because it has a very high response rate. The vast majority of higher education institutions have a 70 to 80% response rate of all final year students. It was initially 22 questions, which I'll go through. It's now 23 because there's one added about students' unions. And it's funded by the Higher Education Funding Council for England on behalf of all the funding councils in the UK, and run by the prominent polling company Ipsos Mori. 3 questions on the survey will be very familiar, or become very familiar to anyone working in quality of student engagement. The first 4 questions are on learning and teaching, and ask questions about staff, quality of staff, and sort of quality of lecturing, and explanations, enthusiasm, the challenge of the curriculum content. Fortunately, this slide is a little incorrect. Questions 5 to 9 are about assessment and feedback, not academic support. Apologies for the mistake there. So a couple of questions about how clear assessment criteria are, and then some of the famous questions about feedback. Questions 10 to 12 are about academic support and whether students feel supported in making their choices and getting through their studies. Questions 13 to 15 on organisation management. That's questions about timetabling, changes to the course, what else? Of course, yeah, sort of generally whether the course is well organised. 16 to 18 about learning resources, that includes the library and IT. Questions 19 to 21 about personal development. This sort of hints at employability, though the questions are a bit vague. Question 22, which is overall satisfaction, and question 23 about the Students' Union. Institutions can add optional banks of questions, so sets of 3 or 4 questions to go on top of the initial 23 questions. Those institutions which have NHS-based courses typically take up that. Less institutions use the other optional banks. There are some interesting ones there. And institutions do have the option to design their own questions, though they rarely do. There are also 2 boxes at the bottom for free text comments, which gives a really rich source of quality data, in addition to all the quantitative data that the survey provides. It's all accessible for institutions when the results come out. Remember, students are sort of initially asked to fill in the survey online. If they don't fill in the survey online and they don't explicitly say, I don't want to fill in the survey, then they'll get a phone call from Ipsos Mori. And if that doesn't get through to them, again, they don't explicitly say, I don't want to fill in the survey, then they will get a paper copy through the post. So this kind of persistent polling is one of the reasons for the survey's high response rate. Like I said, students can opt out, so they could say they don't want to fill it in. For the data to be made public and to be considered valid, on the individual course, a 50% response rate is required, which includes at least 23 individual responses. So on smaller courses, sometimes the data isn't made public enough for individual students, and for these quotas to ensure that answers aren't tied back to students. Institutions seem to have set up a fairly sort of regular and efficient cycle for the NSS and analysing it and building it into their quality cycle. So the survey runs from January until April. We then generally have to wait until August. And when the results come out in August, from August till about November, December time, most institutions are working on action plans to improve their results. And this is where the real interesting things about NSS happen, the discussions about learning and teaching. And I think the best thing about NSS is not so much the data itself, but the conversations that come from it about staff and students sitting down together and discuss students' experiences and focusing those conversations based on the data presents. So the S has really focused some of the debates in UK higher education about feedback on assessment, because regularly students give poor scores for that. It's also focused some debates on course organisation, which in some institutions is really poor according to the data. So it's the conversations out of the NSS results that can often really, really effective. There is all sort of the stick as much as the carrot of NSS is that it's publicly available data and contributes to a lot of league tables. The results are available on Unistats as part of the key information sets, like I said, to inform consumer choice. But the more detailed data sets are available internally from a results site run by a tech company called Texuna Tech. Your institutions or students' unions should have a login which you should be able to access. Unfortunately, we haven't got time in this session to run through how to access that website, how to use it, how to really get into the meat of the results. But We do here at NUS run training sessions on that and have a workbook which sort of takes you through using the results website, accessing the data, which I believe I've put a link to at the end of this presentation. So very quickly, the NSS is sort of the main thing I wanted to cover. We've got about 5 minutes to quickly cover the other two types of surveys that are kind of used in HEs. The first is student evaluations of teaching. These are also known, colloquially, might be known by a number of other names, but sometimes known as module evaluation questionnaires, or student evaluations of educational quality. They may as well. The key thing is that these are surveys that evaluate a specific module or better a specific teacher. And they come in a great variety of forms and layouts and have been used for much longer than the NSS. About student evaluations of teaching is that how they have a much more specific unit of analysis than the NSS, because students filling out the NSS are evaluating their entire course, so all 3 years and all their modules. It's not necessarily specific what they're evaluating, and there's a great amount of evidence to show that there's actually far more variety in educational quality within a course than there is between different courses or between institutions. So module evaluations or student evaluations teaching allow us to much more clearly identify what it is students are evaluating. And there's been loads of research done on the usefulness and effectiveness of these surveys. And with the right survey, ICTs are valid, reliable, robust, and measure a single unit of analysis and a really good proxy for measuring teaching effectiveness. How exactly they are run in institution will vary a great deal. They really are worth looking into in terms of like maximizing the effectiveness and usefulness of these surveys, because they are incredibly good proxies of understanding teaching effectiveness. And I particularly recommend searching for Professor Herb Marsh, who's a professor of education at Oxford and also at the University of Western Sydney, who's done extensive research on this and is really sort of pushing them as useful proxies for teaching effectiveness. And then finally, I just want to cover engagement surveys, in particular the UK's engagement survey. So the two surveys I've covered so far, NSS and SETs, measure students' perceptions of their teachers or their education. So on the NSS, students have to evaluate whether staff are good at explaining things. So students are evaluating what is given to them. Surveys measure student perceptions of their behaviour. Ask questions like asking students to evaluate how much they've worked, how many assignments they've done, and these have been for a very long time in the US and Australia, and have been proven to be really effective measures, proxies for educational effectiveneffectiveness, teacher effectiveness, institutional cultures and communities, and they're arguably far more nuanced way of understanding students and their relationship to their education, and probably sort of arguably less consumerist, less passive, because they ask students to evaluate essentially themselves and the extent to which their educational environments enabled them to engage in their education, which to many people is what education is about. So the famous version is the NSSE, the NSSE, the National Survey of Student Engagement, which is from the United States, and you can go out and see what it's like. Was a UK equivalent set up by the Higher Education Academy. It's called the UK Engagement Survey, the UKES. Only a few institutions, there's an increasing number of institutions that have opted in, not all institutions. If your institution hasn't opted in, I would really recommend trying to explore whether it can in the near future, because it's a really, really interesting survey, and I think it's going to be an incredibly rich source of information for enhancing educational quality within institutions. One advantage it has over the NSS is that it surveys, you can survey all years of degree, not just the final year. Activities that have been proven to benefit learning. So in particular, that is high order learning behaviours, about sort of like deep learning as opposed to surface learning. So you can evaluate whether students are really taking course content or whether they're just learning for exams. Ask questions on collaborative learning, the extent to which students are working together with each other, the quality of staff-student interaction, the amount of challenge that the course gives, the extent to which students are able to reflect on their own learning, and also evaluate one of the best proxy measures for student learning engagement, just how much students are actually working, which is a really useful thing for institutions to understand. So I'm sorry that's a really whistle-stop, very, very quick and brief tour. Sorry we really couldn't get into detail about any of those, but I hope and imagine Amelia is going to be sending around the guides afterwards where I've put some links to some further reading material. Like I said at the beginning, please, if there's anything that makes sense or anything you'd really like to ask about in far more detail and actually sort of with about, please do email morris@nus.org.uk. I hope that was helpful. If a bit sort of introductory, but I'll hand back to Amelia now, as she'll be taking on to the next bit. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Good. Could you just pass me back the presenter ball? I will set Adam up to start his session. Hand over now to Adam. So David, do you just want to turn off your webcam for us, please? Thank you.
On the next bit, yeah. Hopefully everyone can hear me. My name's Adam Wright, and I'm a policy officer here at NUS and work a lot of postgraduate issues. I sit, used to be two steering groups for the PTES and PRES for the HEA, and now been merged into one, which is a kind of base advisory group, but I sit on that and manage sort of NUS's position on just to these surveys. So what I'm going to do is run through with you what these two surveys are all about and how you might use the research within them and show you some of the comparisons between kind of survey and the survey like that David was talking mainly about. The PTES and PRES, they stand for Postgraduate Taught Experience Survey and Postgraduate Research Experience Survey, and they're both run by the Higher Education Academy and were started in I think 2009, and the PTES in 2007. The Taught Experience Surveys run every year, and the Research Experience Surveys run every 2 years. They're basically surveys that are used to analyse and report experience of postgraduate students at different higher education institutions in the UK. The participation is voluntary, so it's not like the National Student Survey. Not all institutions take part in it. Some institutions decide to take part in it every other year. Particularly with the PTES, they might decide to take every 2 years along with the PRES. But some institutions don't take part in it at all. You'll find that one of your institutions might internal survey that is very similar to the PRES or PTES for postgraduate engagement, but that's just an internal survey. It's not one which is benchmarked against national trends. And then some institutions, particularly those that don't have very large postgraduate cohorts, they don't do the survey at all. The results are confidential, so again, unlike the NSF, the data is only shared within an institution. It's confidential, it's not made public. It's used internally by universities so that they can see which areas they're doing well at and which areas they're not doing so well at. But there are national figures that are aggregated that they can benchmark their institution against. And usually the HEA also provide institutions with benchmarks based on the particular mission group or type of university that they're at, but they don't actually share data from other institutions, individual level data that they can then kind of compare against. So that means that it's used in a very different way to the NSS and doesn't get caught up in the kind of market competition and league tables element of a student survey. There are ones, like I said, and they are published in a report each time the surveys are run, and the HEA do their own analysis of the data at national level. People can download and look at. There we go. So there are some important advantages to these two surveys. One is that they're growing in size. When they started out, there were not so many institutions taking part, but they've grown year on year. And now the PRES, the Research Experience Survey, there are 48,000 PhD students took part in the last Research Experience Survey, which was in 2013, at 122 different HEIs across the UK. And PTES, there are more students taking part because there are more PGT students, but less higher education institutions. So there were 67,000 in 2014, which was last year, and they were at 100 different higher education institutions across the country. The reason why the number of HEIs is slightly lower for the PTES is because some institutions choose to only run the survey concurrently with every 2 years with the PRES. So there will be more institutions likely to take part in the PRES this year because there's a PRES this year as well. Other are that there are no incentives for HEIs to kind of manipulate the results. There are political concerns around the use of NSS and how NSS scores are manipulated by institutions in many different ways to try and make them look better, because they're obviously published publicly, and it will affect league table results and competition. But there's no real incentive for institutions to change the results of the PTES or PRES, and so they're usually quite reliable. There's considerable improvements to the design of the two surveys, and that's one of the reasons why the HEA have the advisory group to look at changes to the surveys. For instance, they will look at 3 of different elements or questions within the survey, and they work out which ones are very intercorrelated with one another, so that they can then take out one of those or change the wording of them. They're not basically showing the same thing twice. And they're a lot more streamlined, and the data are a lot better than in some other surveys. So some considerable improvements, and obviously there have been changes to the type of questions that are in the surveys to reflect changes to the postgraduate environment. Questions have gone in recently around student engagement, and also questions around teaching, postgraduate teaching, and the employment responsibilities of postgraduate research students. Like the NSS, HEIs can add in their own questions to the survey and manage that themselves. Often they like to ask specific things, and student unions have sometimes asked to add in their own questions as well, particularly around the kind of engagement that they have with postgraduates, representation structures for postgraduates. And the questions are designed in such a way that they are comparable to questions in the SS, so that you can look at different things at undergraduate level and compare to how an institution does it at a postgraduate level. So a lot of them are worded in such a way that makes them comparable. About how unions and institutions can kind of utilize this from a student engagement perspective. The first thing to do is, if you're a student from a student union, is to find out whether the institution that you're actually takes part in the PRES or PTES or both, and then to make sure that they share the data with you, because they share it internally within the institution. They're just not meant to go public. The institution doesn't then find out what do their own internal survey that's sometimes based on the PTES or PRES, but isn't run by the HEA. It's run internally by the institution, or try and convince them to get on board and actually take part, especially if you have a large postgraduate cohort. institutions might run an internal survey. But again, like I say, this cannot be benchmarked so easily against national trends because it's just an internal survey. But often, if you ask questions to be very similar to those in the PTES or PRES, then they're a lot easier to benchmark them against. You can use this data in different ways if you do receive the data. You to kind of inform the campaigns that an union runs on issues. You can use it to lobby an institution on particular issues relating to postgraduate, particularly if there are certain highlighted areas within data that show that there are certain things that are being done very badly at a particular institution. So you can highlight those areas and say to an institution that has to be dealt with. Or you compare them to what's going on in the NSS and show that there is a difference between undergraduate and postgraduate on those issues. You use it kind of internally within the Students' Union to find out whether or not there are ways that you can improve your own engagement with postgraduates, to see what kind of representative structures, what kind of engagement postgraduates have within their teaching and learning, within their course design and other things, and try and pick up or isolate things that postgraduates seem to want, or things that postgraduates highlight as issues, and try and campaign on those to bring into the kind of work that the Students' Union are doing. And then there are certain chances for you to lobby your institution and include specific questions in the survey that you think might be necessary at this time around. There are certain things that haven't been highlighted within the survey, but know of particular problems, issues that are going on at your institution, and you'd like a questionnaire about that. Or if you're just interested in finding out something about the type of engagement that postgraduates have within Students' Union, and there's not a particular question, like a question 23 that's in the survey. Give you some examples. This is an example of PRES data being used. This is it shows the analysis of employability at a postgraduate research level. It shows the intentions for employment from different postgraduate research students on the blue bars, which comes from the result of the PRES. That's compared against the actual employment of postgraduate research students 6 months after graduating from the Nation of Leavers survey. So you compare the results nationally and then benchmark your institutional results, national results, in other surveys as well to try and work out what's going on. This was quite an interesting graph because it kind of highlights some of the differences between intentions and outcomes at a postgraduate research level. It shows that in some disciplines there are vast differences in the kind of intentions of what the expectations are of postgraduate students and what really happens when they leave in terms of employment. So that's one kind of area in which research could have been used and might have been helpful to a particular campaign level. Another example, but this is from the PTES, looking at PGT students. It shows I'm not sure how clear the chart is, but the chart shows the source of funding for postgraduate taught students, and we know that now most postgraduate taught students are self-funded. And so you look at down at your institutional level results and see whether you're any different to national trends, and if you find that there are particular issues around which students are funding their study, then you kind of use that to run a campaign and lobby around either preventing fees from rising, lowering fees, or providing more bursaries and scholarships or other types of financial support for students, and into a more mainstream campaign around postgraduate funding. So that you could use that data. I'm going to show off just by thinking about some of the important additions that have been made, particularly to the PTES, really. As part of the work that we've been doing with the HEA, we've been trying to lobby them to change some of the questions within the PTES, particularly to make them more focused around student engagement. And we'll continue to do that, and there might be some changes to the PRES as well that comes around. the particular changes that we made was in the PTES, there's now a statement which reads, "I am encouraged to be involved in decisions about how my courses run," with trying to really get down to the fact of whether or not there's some degree of ownership involved in the construction and co-production of a course at a postgraduate taught level. One of the things was that there's discussion around whether there should be a kind of question 23 like there is in the NSS at a postgraduate level, and we've been arguing against that for a number of reasons. Because student unions can put the question in themselves if they feel that it's necessary, but also because it will be not particularly helpful in terms of trends. The actual numbers will be very low anyway, and it won't really. It might be used by an institution to complain that the student union aren't doing enough, when actually the engagement is a lot higher than it shows in the actual data. It might not be that helpful to have a question 23 style question. It's much more thought to have a question that was more about student engagement generally. But student unions can, in their own institutional level kind of data and questions to try and find out about these trends. That's about it from me. Hope that's been helpful, and I'm happy to answer any questions on the two surveys afterwards.
That's really good in terms of how you can utilise, institutions and student unions can utilise both of those types of surveys. So now I'm going to hand over to Alan. So we'll get that sorted.
Okay. Have a Yeah, excellent. Hi, I'm a policy development manager. Over the past 3 or 4 years, I've worked on a number of research projects through NUS, mainly around student financial well-being, but also widening participation, and then I moved on to more wide policy engagement and how both S and students' unions know, if you want to be epistemological about it, what this is. So I focus on some qualitative methods. Just 2 examples I'm going to give really. Probably some things that are less exhaustive than, say, like mass franchise surveys, and maybe some way of describing stories of students' lives, probably in batches might be the way of doing it. We'll have a resource requirements, and I know about just kind of other ways of examining the student experience. So hopefully you'll find this interesting. Not me trying to do this, knocking to anyone face to face. So well, that's gone back to engagement surveys, which terrifies me. We're going this way? No, I'm not. Oh, thanks. A rogue slide. I was going to deliver some of Adam's content there, which would have been awful. Trust me. Right. So we'll start with Liverpool Students' Union in 2012. 2 members of staff there, Gary Hughes and Ed Maloney, just so that they don't accuse me of not citing them when I talk about their work. They supported us on the project Pound in Your Pocket, which looked into student financial well-being. That a franchise survey across the membership, about 15,000 responses. But what we needed were qualitative pieces to really get into the depth of what was going on within the membership, to understand some of the problems as lived experiences. And I've picked out Liverpool Students' Union's work that they did with Liverpool John Moores as an example, just because it was a beautiful, perfectly formed piece of work that fitted kind of the size of LU's ability to do research, if you want to call it that, and the methodology suited the problem. So let's get on. One was a diary project, which are really interesting kind of studies of students' lives. They did it in a particularly interesting way that looked at cash flow lived. They basically paid £1 a day to 20 students from medicine and midwifery, from faculty of health and applied social sciences, £1 a day to basically log they'd spent and kind of give some detail around how they felt about it, or describing what that was about, what that day-to-day, and they did this for just over a month. That, as you'll see, an ability to look at obviously you'll see the graph in a minute, and also some of the things that surveys don't necessarily draw out, actually to change policies on financial support. Now, I know that we've got a lot of student engagement, learning and teaching here, and the finance example, but I think this can apply, and we'll get into it and see how this works. And survey as well, but I'm not really focusing on that. You know, there were 40 students who completed the whole exercise, and that was kind of their initial bursary levels. So there's a range of students from different backgrounds, different disciplines, and essentially we were tracking how close they came to absolute rock bottom. The idea. Here you see all the colours have changed. There's 11 of the 14 students apparently on the graph, but you get the idea. You see the lines as it goes over time. You see that big jump in the middle is when they all received a bursary. And what this study was trying to go with, each one of those days on the bottom, every participant logged what went that day briefly, and I've got an example coming up, I hope. Yes, so student number 2, a midwifery student, and just each of these quotes was taken from a different day while it was going on, detailing what the cost was, whether it was unexpected, those kind of things. Trouble was a big thing that came out, as you can imagine, with nursing and midwifery, and it just adds that kind of quantifiable part to the stats and the student story. Now, I was thinking about this before, how you could apply this. I was wondering, you know, if you had a small cohort of students within a discipline or within the institution, and they might report on another thing on a Likert scale. It might be how they motivate. You might do a study over a fortnight about motivation, placements, over particular. I mean, imagine the dissertation experience, those kind of things. So it's for you to design, but I present this as just an interesting way of going about quite a small focused study that is innovative, if anything. It's an experiment. And therefore at least draws students into, the issue itself as reporting on it. So let's go on to the imitation game. Unfortunately, it's not the film, but a fascinating piece of work from Cardiff School of Social Science. Me and colleagues from NUS and from other student unions went to the Research Methods Festival in Oxford this summer, which was put on by the ESRC. And this was the standout session for me and a number of delegates. And so the image is essentially the Turing test, if you've heard of that. So it's basically where the test, a computer tries to fool you that it's a human. So you have, in this diagram, you see the judge is participant C, and you have, they can't see who A and B are. They have to guess by asking questions of A and B which one is the real person and which one's the computer. So, social scientist in Cardiff, who's I forget right now. I've got a link at the end to all of this stuff, so you can look at it. And unfortunately, I should have written his name down. He's great. A social scientist was working with physicists essentially, and he wanted to explore the larger practice and to see how norms were built around cultures within different disciplines. And so he decided to apply the Turing test to that environment. He'd worked with these scientists for a number of years, observing how they work together, and essentially went in as participant A. He went as the computer, and the job was, a physicist was to ask him and another physicist various questions about the discipline. As I think the rules were they don't have to go into they can't go into too much difficulty. They can't actually trip them up knowledge. It's got to be about the language of practice, as described it. And it was found that you could pretty much get away with it. And you know, this is in much mirth. I think it's based on an old kind of Victorian game as well, a parlour game. But he's really interested in. They went out and did a study with blind people and sighted people, where a person would ask questions of two respondents, one of which was blind and the other one was sighted, pretend to answer as a blind person. And the reverse was done with a sighted person asking a blind person and a sighted person. questions were around understanding of being blind or sighted, depending on the experiment. And there was fascinating. What this was that blind people, 86% of the blind people were successful in passing off as a sighted person, judged them as being, well, they're the sighted person. With sighted people, 13% were successful. And their studies went through, they did religion, football at one point, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, basically anywhere where the minority was present, I suppose, is the best way of putting it. It was found that because the lived experience was in the minorities, so the sighted people's sort of, like, they would always pass. I mean, this in and of itself is interesting in terms of sociology, but that's just to think about how this work in international environment or others. So they were testing this language of practice or international expertise, as I've already mentioned, and they played this game 12,000 times. And as well as the result of the game, like I said, the 13% sort of thing, there were 2 times qualitative data. Questions asked by the judges, which in and of themselves kind of demonstrated the parameters around identity. So the judge would make up a question and goes, what kind of question can I ask someone? I can tell whether they're from Liverpool, for example, without asking them about a particular street. So I might ask about their attitude of living in a family with Everton and Liverpool supporters. And the value is, certainly to me, but if you iterate it 12,000 times and you start to get these things come together, what are the values or the lived experiences of people from Liverpool, or people, or English students, or American students, those kind of things. The one where they look at is the answers by the imitators, so the perceptions of others around that particular, that identity that they don't identify with. Why we loved it, because we were like, well, the number of applications of this were astonishing. Around gender, sexuality, religion, level, and we started to think about, well, what study type? What you did 100 student research intensive institutions, 2 teaching intensive institutions. What are the impressions of each other's experience? What can you understand by the bias when a teaching intensive student, well, 100 of them, I suppose, form questions around what's it to meet deadlines by XYZ, or meet tutorials, or what kind of thing, what ways are they describing their experience that informs what delivery is like in their institution. The same with vocational, liberal arts courses. Interestingly, we discussed academic students in terms of what being a student. What do students perceive it's like to be an academic, and what do academics actually perceive it's like to be a student on the program? And people poked fun at us and said, well, what about sabbaticals and non-sabbaticals? So, what does a student think an SU president actually gets up to, and is it an interesting litmus test for the effectiveness of officers? But nonetheless, we're going to try this at NUS, and I just think this is an absolutely fascinating method. They've got funding to propagate it in any and all but ways possible. I'm sure they'd be delighted to hear from you. I'll put a link on the end here. Oh, Ben, has anything been done using this idea, looking at the attainment gap in demographics? No, I mean, the truth is it hasn't been used. Yeah, that's what we were exploring in the seminar. What ways could it be used in this area? They've used it in essentially what we might call liberation, I suppose, to look at that barriers, social barriers. But they opened the floor, and we had a long discussion about different ways it could be applied with environment. And we mainly spoke about, well, different modes of study or different forms of study will be invested in. You might have a conversation, if you think about these as conversations between have been on placements and who will be on placements, then you start to understand some of the information needs for students before they go into a placement, for example. So things were the things we were thinking around. I recommend you take a look at the site, the links are there, and get in touch with them, and we'll try and do some stuff as well. I hope that was okay. Thanks.
I think that was a really interesting kind of alternative method that I've heard about, and they're really, really interesting. If any of you have got any questions, Ad and Alan are around to answer any questions that you might have, so just put them in the chat box for us. But if not, thank you very much for coming along today. I hope you found it useful. There was quite a lot of information there, but we will go through things in the online discussion on Thursday. So again, thank you all for coming. Any questions, we will hang around a bit for you. Okay, thank you. Just in answer to your kind of question around where to start.
Go for Adam first. Where could you start?
Well, it depends what you want to do, really. But there are some good kind of textbooks which look at social research and using surveys. One of the books that I use most is by a guy called Dave Duval. And we can write it down for you, and it's called Surveys in Social Research, and it runs through pretty much everything that you need to know about search and how survey data. You can use it and analyze it, but it's quite introductory, so it doesn't go into too much maths and statistics to make it really difficult, particularly if you have a background in research. I think generally it's sitting down and look at the data and trying to get a feel for whether you can see. Usually things pop out at you when you see big differences, when you can see trends. So the two things you want to look at really when you're looking at survey data is to see whether there are big differences between different groups of people, big differences between years. So you can analyze trends to see whether things are going up and down across time, and then you go look at differences within a particular time period. So a cross-sectional analysis, you're looking at different groups of people within a particular time period and whether there are big differences in it. And stuff that we've been talking about today, benchmarking against other institutions or against national trends. And so you want to try and pick out what institution is doing well or what an institution is doing badly in comparison to other universities of a similar type. But often you're just looking at other universities in general. You can kind of highlight some of the good and bad practice that an institution has, or certain areas that might be perceived of as issues.
Yeah, I would add really is because of research background myself either. This is about, so you'll get a hunch or things like will either appear out of a bunch of numbers that you want to know, oh, is that a problem or is that a thing? Or sort of feedback or reviews, complaints, if you think about the way advice centres work, and you might go, oh, maybe NZ isn't working, and you want to test it. I think the real trick is to find the thing that you want to test. Which is like, what do I think that the problem is, and therefore what do I believe might be a then test against that. I think if I do a plug, actually, really good value for money is probably the Society for Research into Higher Education. They do workshops on research methods and stuff like that as well. It's on a year to be a member, but the sessions, if you just go to a session, range between £5 and £70 in King's Cross. They do quite good workshops, I think, as well. The Society for Research into Higher Education, se.ac.uk.
Questions before the rest of you want to go? Useful then.